This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, consumer interest advocate Ralph Nader is heard in part one of a talk recorded in the James Hilton Coliseum here at Iowa State last November. The conclusion of Mr. Nader's talk can be heard next week at this same time. Mr. Nader.
The conventional way to make a speech, is to start off with a joke and have a particular coherent sequence, beginning, middle, end, with a euphoric conclusion. And I'm going to avoid that this evening. It's not very difficult to avoid. I want to talk about 4 or 5 main themes, not by way of any attempt to particularly persuade or change anybody's mind, just by way of directing attention to some of the problems that many of you have already thought about, but perhaps described in a slightly different way. And then to ask the toughest question of all, basically what can be done about these problems, right down to the people in this auditorium. The first problem that seems to confront us everywhere we turn is the overriding issue of runaway technology. This is the culmination of a very rapid engineering and scientific development that started a couple centuries ago, which obviously brought a great number of benefits, but which increasingly is beginning to build up costs that are not quantified to take into account as a balance against the benefits, which are often hidden, which often wreak great havoc and pain and anguish and waste, and which are not structured by any institutions in terms of their diminishment or their prevention. A leading technology, obviously, is the automobile. Another technology is the chemical assault on pests or insects, which has quite obvious secondary effects, right down to the breadbasket of the average American family. There is the technology, obviously, of medical advances. Again, not all benefits, including pharmaceuticals. There are rather distinct costs and byproduct effects. There's the problem of a humming industry spewing forth contamination into the air. There's the increasing severance between man's relationship to nature and all that means in its psychological and communal depth. And there are, of course, the more futuristic technologies that we have hardly begun to account for. The effect of the computer on invasion of privacy, or the effect of weaponry in terms of building up intolerable risk levels into the future, or the effect of new forms of energy production, such as nuclear power plants in terms of their byproduct risk levels or concurrent hazards that may occur from the production of the installation to its disposal of the waste. Now, these are just a bare sketch of the kind of technology which has to be reduced within a framework of understanding of very basic values. For instance, some of these costs that we're talking about are basic forms of violence. Pollution is a form of violence. The word pollution itself is a far too charitable designation of what we're really talking about, which is an assault on people's physiological integrity by the exposure to gases, chemicals, vapors, particulate matter in their proliferating range. The ranks of emphysema victims and cancer victims and heart disease and other debilities are, of course, attributed to a great many inputs and environments, but recognizing that fact doesn't absolve the environmental pollution factor from having an ever significant role. Pollution also destroys property. It depreciates property. Ask anybody who lives near a polluting foundry or a steel mill what their homes are worth compared to what they would be worth if they were not in pollution-intense zones. Pollution is just one spin-off. We're now dealing, of course, in what scientists call big biology or microbiology as two divisions that are going to upset a great deal of predictable patterns of future behavior. In many ways, we're altering the balance, the very delicate balance that's taken many, many, many centuries to develop between human beings and their natural surroundings. And we're doing it by virtue not of conquering nature, but of poisoning nature, of contaminating it to a point where it begins to turn on its abusers, as is quite expected. Indeed, this kind of assault on people's health and future genetic inheritance is one of the prime forms of human violence, which is on the growth throughout the world. But it's a peculiar type of violence. It does not provoke immediate sensory pain or anguish. It often cannot be smelled or tasted or felt or seen, which means that it's a form of man-made environmental violence that transcends man's traditional physiological capability to respond to it. This is a very significant, I think, turn in the saga of human history, because what it really means is that we are developing the kinds of hazards, many of them very silent, invisible, cumulative in their impact over time, attacking cell or tissue structure, the kinds of violence that have rendered us physiologically obsolete to alert ourselves to it. For example, this auditorium could be now being subjected, let's say, to 95 parts per million of carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, tasteless gas, an acknowledged form of violence. And who would know it? You can't sense it. The same is true if it was an auditorium subjected to excessive levels of radiation. Again, you can't feel it, taste it, see it, touch it. It's a silent, accumulative form of violent impact on people's health. You wake up in the morning, how many of you fill a glass full of water and say, aha, cadmium levels up today? You can't see it. And this kind of invisible onrush of environmental contaminants are basically challenging the very capability of human beings to respond, because they can't rely on sense of pain or sense of imminent peril, such as an approaching fire. They've got to rely on their minds, which in turn means they've got to rely on rather special type of knowledge, scientific, medical, legal, and the systems that will foresee or prevent these technological impacts. Now, throughout the country, the increasing technological issue, aside from physical harm, is economic cost. In the last 6 years, all the riots in all the cities took about $700 million worth of property damage. Now, that isn't even 1 month's property damage that's attributed by the federal government to air pollution itself, which wasted or cost about $16 billion last year alone. And that's just one form of pollution, air pollution. If you add other forms such as water pollution, the contamination, destruction of fishery resources in portions of the fishing industry, and the other consequential effects of contaminating water resources, the billions mount up even more. So we have a situation where the law, for reasons that are quite obvious, the law has permitted, if not legitimized, a form of property destruction by some forces onto other forces, factories, industries, onto innocent owners of property, that does not obey any injunctions or does not have to pay compensation. Indeed, whenever a court awards a local residential area damages because of a cement plant or aluminum plant's destruction or impairment of property or property values, it's rather national news because of its uniqueness or rareness. And yet the law for something like 500 years, going back into England, permitted Jones to recover damages from Smith if Smith struck Jones and injured Jones. And yet now we have a new form, relatively speaking, in the millennium of time, a new form of property destruction from the kinds of contaminants that come out of industries, and the law is just beginning to catch up. Yet if the question was asked, what is the chief form of destruction or impairment of property values in this country, people would start guessing, riots, burglaries, student unrest, and the like, when it's quite clearly U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, American Cyanamid, Kennecott Copper, and all the other polluters who refuse to reduce a minimum of their investment to the kind of pollution control equipment or the process change or the pre-cycling that would begin to reduce the levels of destruction that is heaped on innocent parties and owners of property. Indeed, pollution, while it affects everybody, affects poorer people more. Who else works more frequently in polluted zones? Who goes down into the coal mines? Who works in the copper mines? Who works and exposes themselves to pesticide contamination in the orchards and in the fields? And who lives near the steel mills or the chemical plants or the other industrial areas? It's obviously blue-collar workers, lower economic classes, minority groups, the poor, by and large. So the environmental impact as a breakdown in technology has this kind of class impact as well. Indeed, in attempting to document this, we went through the residence location of the chief executives of the major corporations in the country, and not a single one was found to be raising their family near any one of their beloved plants. They were, by and large, living in shrubbered suburbs far away from the pollution-intense zones in and around Gary, Indiana, Alloy, West Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, or wherever you can point the direction to these particular zones. Another impact of technology really raises fundamental democratic questions by way of why don't we develop the technology that will curb the cost of other technology, the pollution control equipment, the safer automobiles, the mass transit systems. And this is largely a question that often resolves itself into a rather abstract excursus into allocation of resources. What it really simply means is that we have developed an elitist type of technological progress. If you ask yourself, in the last 25 years, where has technology really developed spectacularly? It's developed in the area of space technology, defense and missile systems. It's developed in the area of automated production lines in factories, and in the area of computers. But in many other areas that affect the daily lives of 200 million Americans, medical and hospital delivery systems for one, mass transit systems for another, cheap and adequate housing for a third, pollution control for a fourth, occupational health and safety for a fifth, and automobile safety for a sixth. These areas have been starved of technological impact and input that could give life and save injuries and produce a much higher standard of living. Indeed, we are now finally coming to a point where we're beginning to measure the quality of the economy, not just its increase in gross national product, because we know that just piling up the gross national product without asking where is this gross national product being directed is not going to gauge the progress in terms of the justice and the quality of the standard of living that Americans certainly deserve. Indeed, in many ways, the concept of the gross national product has outlived a great deal of its usefulness because of its extreme focus on dollar levels, yes, even real dollar levels, taking into account inflation, but not on asking the question, exactly how is the flow going of all this wealth and resources that this country has built up into large piles? And the question is not just how is it distributed to poor people and to lower economic level groups. The question is what is distributed to everybody? Let me give you an illustration. There is now, in a complex economy, which is one of the definitions of a complex economy, a capability of taking social costs or taking tragedies or taking miseries and responding to them in a way that develops sub-industries or sub-economies. For instance, collisions on the highway. millions of them every year, 55,000 fatalities a year, 4.5 million injuries a year. These generate a whole range of economic needs: medical, hospital, insurance, repair, funeral, a whole list of economic needs that arise after cars crash. This represents a sub-industry. It's necessary at the present time. That's the needs that have to be met. The problem is that it is a classic form of economic growth. It generates jobs, it generates income, there are expenditures, there are services, there are goods produced and sold. And the more crashes there are on the highway, the larger is the accident injury industry, and the greater the contribution to economic growth. Indeed, about all we're left with, until a few years ago, before some tools were being forged to do something about this epidemic on the highways, about all we were left with was the ability to say to someone who was lying, dying, or bleeding on the highway that at least he or she was contributing to the gross national product, which is hardly a consolation. Now, that is a form of economic growth. It's about $20 billion right now, every year. But that's not the form of economic growth that we can be proud of or even evaluate in terms of the kinds of quality of standard of living that we want. Indeed, ideally, we'd want to eliminate this industry or diminish it very drastically. But when all these figures are registered and they come up into the concept of gross national product, you don't see those sub-segments. You just see those dollar figures: $800 billion, $1 trillion last year in the gross national product, and a growth of another 80 billion just increase in the coming year is the prediction. So technology has got to bend before democratic values so it can be distributed more equitably to meet the needs of people all over the country. Look at the bizarre gap now between the mighty growth of our economy and the inability to meet the most fundamental needs of people. Just getting around on the ground is getting to be impossible for millions of Americans who either cannot afford a car or are too young or too old to drive a car. The medical delivery system need more be said. It's a disgrace in terms of its cost and in terms of its distribution right down to the rural areas, where there are counties without hospitals or a single physician. Dozens and dozens of counties in the United States. Not to mention the slums, rural and urban, where there are 400,000 people in a major city slum with no more than a few dozen doctors, or one maybe perhaps hospital that's supposed to service their needs. The problems abound everywhere. They're problems that a giant economy such as ours should easily be solving if it was redirected along a qualitative path instead of simply rushing forward in a juggernaut of quantitative impact that is creating more problems than it's solving. These are some aspects of technology, but basic to understanding the dimensions of technology as a challenge to basic sense of justices and basic value systems is to develop a perceptual awareness of the process. For example, you've all gone by hundreds of thousands of highway signs and poles, if not millions, as you travel along a highway. Does it ever occur to people to ask the question, why are these highway poles and signs, particularly on our interstate, why are they rooted in concrete, other than to reduce the damage done to them by cars that collide into them? That's hardly a justification, because a humane technological approach long ago would have said, when it comes to a collision between a car and a highway pole, isn't it more humane for the highway pole to give way rather than for the car to wrap itself around the highway pole? And so highway designers are beginning to do just that. With pilot programs in Texas and elsewhere, they are developing breakaway signs and poles so that if a car crashes into these poles at any level above, say, 7 or 8 miles per hour, the sign or the pole will break away, giving the car a longer period of time and distance with which to slow down more safely. A simple example that shows that you can design with the same materials a technology that requires human beings to adjust to the severity, or a technology that adjusts to human beings' needs, capacities, even anticipating their failures. The same is true with the design of the automobile. Again, every time there's a note in the paper about a fatal crash, it's immediately attributed to the driver, without even any investigation. Recently, there have been more on-the-spot investigations of vehicle crashes, and the role of the highway and the role of the vehicle are emerging as quite important, if not singular, then contributing factors. And if you ponder it a little further, you might ask the following startling question. If we have a right to expect all drivers to be perfect in order to prevent crashes, why don't we have a right to expect all cars to be perfect and automatically prevent crashes? What an outlandish proposition. The fact that in this space age that we're living in, that there could be developed a sensor system unit built in cars which would detect impending collisions and be able to actuate braking and steering systems in order to prevent the collision itself or reduce it to a very modest level of severity. Why isn't that question asked? Because most people don't understand the extent to which technology has been allocated away from people's needs and the extent to which mass production, given different investment priorities for safety in the auto industry, the extent to which mass production can reduce the costs of these features enormously. Indeed, one of the most secret figures in the auto industry is something that they should be most proud of, namely their production economies. But I suppose it would upset a number of people if it was disclosed that General Motors has a production cost of its spark plugs under 10 cents, or that seatbelt shoulder harness unit is purchased for under $5, or the engine in a 1966 Ford Galaxy runs about $73 in terms of production cost. That if people really knew what the production economies were, they'd have a healthier demand, a higher expectation for new technology to replace the stagnant carriage on wheels that has hardly changed in terms of its polluting and safety functions since the early part of the century. That's the kind of attitude toward technology that's got to be developed, like the 8-year-old child on her way in a taxi to the Philadelphia airport with her mother. She looked up at the polluting refinery. She said, "Look at all that terrible pollution." 10 years ago, her predecessor might have said, "Look at all that smoke." There's an advance in perception here. And this is the kind of educational process that should begin back in the elementary schools, in the kindergarten and the first grades, and in the 4th and 8th grades. Instead of learning about the petroleum industry and the auto industry on the basis of free and very expensively colored brochures produced by the American Petroleum Institute and the Automobile Manufacturers Association, perhaps these students could be exposed to more informative and critical and true materials that would sharpen their facilities to question and to evaluate technology as it affects their lives. Another theme that's really quite important and quite allied, of course, is the law. The law itself, premised on equal access or equal opportunity to avail of its benefits, premised on an equal enforcement, premised on response to new conditions, premised on allocating resources, economic and political, technological, in a more fair way. The law has run on rough times in recent decades. It not only, of course, has been shown to be grossly inequitable in the civil rights area, it is shown to be extremely inequitable in the kind of behavior it permits corporations to engage in, or large, powerful interest groups, compared to the kind of behavior that it permits individuals to be engaged in. You go in and around Detroit, the home of the auto industry, and you see a remarkable divergence in the application of the law. For example, it is a crime for an individual to relieve himself in the Detroit River, but it's not a crime at all for corporations to relieve themselves in the Detroit River. And indeed, an argument can be made for duress in the first instance, which cannot be applied in the latter instance. And the level of contamination and the seriousness of the health hazard is certainly far greater in the second instance. The double standard. There's a fellow you might have read about, I'm sure you have, called the Fox, who operates in the Fox Valley south of Chicago. Nobody knows who he is. He's been operating for about 2 years, but from what we can judge of his behavior, he's a rather reactionary gentleman. He truly believes in the industry claim that the extent of their pollutants cannot be disclosed because they're trade secrets and proprietary information. So what he does is, because he really believes that the company should keep their pollutants because it's their private property, he goes around and he stuffs up effluent pipes along rivers in order that the effluents back up into the factories. Now this has, of course, disturbed the forces of corporate law and order. Don't like to apply it to themselves. And he is being searched for by the police. And if he is caught, there will be probably the environmental self-defense trial of the century. He will not be at a loss for lawyers, quite obviously, but he will make the following argument. He will say that the polluters that he worked against were in effect invading his environment and his right and his family's right to non-poisonous environmental surroundings. That these companies were not only doing this empirically, but they were violating an 1899 law which prevents the dumping of pollutants into navigable waterways. That they were violating this law year after year, and that the government is not prosecuting these violators. Indeed, the government didn't discover this law until 1969, on its 70th birthday. And since then, it's only brought about 150 cases out of 40,000 daily corporate violators of this far-seeing legislation. And of course, this kind of argument is just another extension of the need for the law to recognize that where there is chronic violation of the law, there needs to be the right of citizens to initiate their own legal actions in place of the official prosecutors who have so defaulted on their obligations. This is hardly a radical new doctrine. It happens to be about 500 years old, going back again to the common law in England. It's called a qui tam type proceeding, where if the officials do not enforce a particular law, and the statute usually provides for this, as the 1899 statute does, it has to, otherwise it can't be availed. If the law is not enforced, a citizen can in effect file as a private attorneys general in place of the official prosecutors who did not enforce the law. It's amazing how many of these equitable doctrines that are now being developed by public interest lawyers and applied to new environmental pollution conditions were first developed 500 or 600 years ago in England. It's an indication, I think, of the need to recognize that the law, first of all, has so overpriced itself that it cannot be used by most Americans. Just consider how many consumer grievances you may have had, whether they deal with autos or insurance or finance, and ask yourself how many of these grievances could you have gone to a lawyer and had him take the case and file action in court. By far, the overwhelming majority cannot endure the expense, delay, and attrition of legal action. And even if they can endure it in terms of time and energy, oftentimes the payment will be greater than what is recouped by way of legal damages.
What's important, I think, to recognize is that the law has got to be,
First of all, accessible. It's got to be available on demand. That you can't expect people to have legal rights that mean anything unless you give them remedies and legal representation with ease. And there are many rights that people have. If you buy a GM car, it turns out to be a lemon, you can sue GM. Got plenty of legal rights. Good luck. What kind of remedies do you have? Can you get the car fixed? Can you get a new car replaced for the lemon? Can you get compensation for lost time? Can you, in effect, afford to hire a lawyer and go to court? Because most lemon problems are $300, $400, $500, $600 at most. It's impossible. And that's why these consumer grievances build up, and the frustration builds up, and the contempt or disrespect for the law builds up. The same, of course, is true on an accentuated scale in the poverty area. You go to city slums, and what do you see? You see landlords, slum landlords, that are hiding behind corporate shells so that they can hardly ever be reached by the arm of the law, even if the tenants manage to sue them. The corporate shell is the big buffer, and they can collapse the corporation or go bankrupt and sweep the rug out from under the plaintiffs. You see health codes are not enforced. You see a very low level of fire and police protection compared to more affluent parts of the city. Those are generating constitutional cases of unequal protection of the law at the present time. You see a whole range of corruption, of collusion between enforcement officials and criminal elements. Indeed, the kind of investigation that's going on in New York at the present time with the police is symptomatic of a breakdown in the law enforcement process that has not only ceased to enforce the laws even-handedly, but ceased to even withstand the temptation of colluding with the illegal forces. Everywhere the process is seen as a process of impersonality, of a process of barriers, of a process where the law is viewed as an enemy or as an oppressor. Indeed, where the law is often used as an instrument of oppression instead of as an instrument of humanity and order and justice as it was originally conceived to be. The law's problems merge right into the third theme, which is bureaucracy, a word that is now used sort of pejoratively. I want to use it more clinically. Bureaucracy basically affects any large organization. In fact, I suppose you could develop a dictionary of aphorisms about bureaucracy. You can say bureaucracy starts at 2. You say bureaucracy is the opiate of the people, or it's the common bond of mankind. Everywhere you go, you meet it, whether it's university administrations, whether it's labor unions, whether it's large corporations, whether it's the more traditional repository, namely government agencies. And what it means is the following. It means a hierarchical set of human organizations whereby responsibility is very heavily diffused for various actions, and accountability is almost impossible for victims to impose on perpetrators within the bureaucracy. It's a system where the institution is the buffer, the insulator, the immunizer from accountability on the part of the officials or the corporate executives or others who are generating the decisions and using the power that may have such detrimental effect. Many of our studies on government agencies in Washington continually focus on this theme. For instance, in the old Pesticide Regulation Division in the Department of Agriculture, there were a period of some 20 years where the violations were stacked up in the files of that division, and not once was a case referred to the Justice Department for prosecution. And they were not technical violations only, they were serious violations. Indeed, the whole concept of regulation of pesticide has reduced itself into this rather very, very emotion-ridden debate. Do you want pesticides or do you want food? As if those were the only two alternatives. To try to get the discussion focused on, for example, how much investment is being put in development of non-chemical controls of pests that have fewer environmental costs? Or what about the chemical companies, in effect, building fear into the farmers in order to get them to use more pesticides more frequently during the year. Overprescribing of pesticides is very similar to the overprescribing of pharmaceuticals in some medical circles. These are the kinds of questions which need to be asked, and the bureaucracy in Washington didn't. Now, what do you do when the bureaucracy refuses systematically to enforce the law that it is sworn to uphold? Well, that's a problem that challenges the very guts of our democratic process. Because if we cannot make people responsible for their official decisions in government, we're never going to make government agencies responsible, or government, period. You can't make institutions responsible unless you make people in those institutions accountable for the consequences direct of their use of power. The whole problem of bureaucracy has received so little attention in the educational system. That doesn't mean that there have to be courses called Bureaucracy 101 or Bureaucracy 302. It does mean that there has to be a deep empirical inquiry into precisely how a bureaucracy can be so inefficient, so costly, so inhumane, so unaccountable, or how it can be, on occasions, a marvel of administrative efficiency or responsive. Take the models as well as the caricatures. This requires a kind of empirical investigation that's got to go way beyond the traditional political science or civics textbooks, which sort of have this formalistic description of how things are supposed to work, with a few dashes on what lobbies are supposed to do or what special interest groups are supposed to do. But very, very little empirical content on exactly how does Program A in Washington or in Des Moines actually work. How does the Insurance Commission in Des Moines work? Exactly. How are complaints handled? How are rate requests handled? What's the political and economic process and interchange? What are the conflicts of interest? What's the problem of an adversary system that doesn't have an adversary except for special interest representation, but not for the public interest? Who decides these questions? Is there such a thing as aggrieved citizens filing suit and making a government official accountable, or making him disclose information that's secret and has been withheld? These are very, very important issues because they deal with the overriding problem of whether we can organize ourselves to deal with problems in this country. And that's the problem of the delivery system of bureaucratic structures. A bureaucracy has a dimension to it in terms of corporate participation and control. What are we going to do about the corporate sector in the country as it challenges some of our basic value systems, as it runs increasingly out of control, as it increasingly dominates the economy in fewer and fewer corporate hands? You've seen it in the agricultural areas as these giant integrated agribusiness firms move in more and more. What does that mean? We're now seeing that it doesn't necessarily mean efficiency. Indeed, that the minimal scale of economies on a farm have far been exceeded by giant outfits like Tenneco or the Tejon Ranch in California or any number of giant agribusiness corporations. About 3 years ago, I went down to the Department of Agriculture and I said, would you please supply me with a study that details the concentration of land ownership in the United States? They said, we don't have that data. I said, you don't have that data? You don't have information that can tell a citizen how many firms own what percentage of what land in what state in the United States? They said, no, we don't compile it. Well, I had to remind them that about 10 years before that, I obtained from the Department of Agriculture the most detailed studies of the concentration of land ownership in the Central American countries, in Latin America, in Asia. In other words, they had concentration studies on many of the underdeveloped countries right down to the percentage point, but they didn't have any right here in the USA. And there turns out to be a pretty good reason for that. It's an explosive political issue. If people realize the enormous concentration of land ownership in Southern California in a few giant corporate ranch-type operations, ranging from 3 to 500,000 acre spreads, or if they realize, for example, that in Texas there are single land holdings that are larger than the state of Delaware, they'd begin pondering the economic and political and democratic consequences of that for small businesses, small farmers, consumers, citizens, everywhere. And if you don't have the data, obviously you're not going to be able to generate that kind of issue for public discussion. Another way of putting it is any institution, whether it's a corporation or a government agency, that can control the flow of information, can pretty much control the flow of policy decision making. And the flow of information is the first step in breaking the log jams to develop the government, as the saying goes, of the people, by the people, and for the people. The function of freedom of flow of information is one of the chief areas of restrictive concentration by any deteriorating bureaucracy, one that doesn't want external forces to evaluate its performance. And the best way to assure that result is to clamp down hard on the doors of secrecy. The corporations, however, have managed to penetrate governmental apparatus quite openly. There's no conspiracy necessary. They have done it by having their trade associations, their campaign fund contributions, their corporate lawyers right there at the scene of the action in Washington and state capitals. If anything, these new buildings that are going up in Washington, you say, how can this city keep building these office buildings? Well, as long as these trade groups and these company offices keep coming in, they're going to keep building these office buildings. That's Washington's principal industry outside of government. And there they are. They know what's going on in the Department of Interior before the Secretary of Interior knows what's going on. The oil industry can find out what's being proposed because they're largely doing the proposing right inside the Department of Interior, which is nothing more than an accounts receivable for the oil industry to begin with. Many of the top officials shuttle in and out of the industry, and they go into government for a little on-the-job training in order to make them more useful when they go back into the corporate framework. The conflict of interest potential here, of course, is potentially very devastating. In fact, it's matured in its devastation in the following programs. The oil industry, a long time ago, threw capitalism over the board. They can't stand competitive economic systems. They want control. They developed a world cartel, and they've developed production quota limits in the United States to keep supply at a level so that the prices don't go down too far. And they've developed their own tax privileges and the tax laws, the oil depletion allowance, the write-off of intangibles. And finally, they decided, well, let's have the final destruction of the competitive mechanism. They went to Washington in 1959, and by executive order, they didn't even go through Congress. That would be far too cumbersome. They got the president to sign an executive order saying, in effect, that there would be a limitation on the importation of oil into this country, 12% of domestic consumption, which in effect sealed off a main force to drive down the price of gasoline and fuel products, energy, if you will, to the consumer. And so people go to their gas stations every day and they pay a nickel extra a gallon because the oil industry, many of whom control these foreign oil sources, not like you're giving business to foreigners, because the oil industry, in effect, has controlled supply in such a way as to keep the domestic price of oil up, a nickel a gallon, at least. That adds up to a lot of money, particularly when you add fuel prices, home fuel prices. It adds up, according to Nixon's own task force on the oil import quota, to $5 to $7 billion a year. That's what the consumer is directly subsidizing the oil industry, which cannot stand free and open competition. And what we're seeing is a basic transformation of our political economic system into what has been called the corporate state, which really means the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few large corporations. And 200 of the biggest corporations in this country own about 70% of the productive capacity of the nation. The concentration then moves into the public arena and begins controlling government or public resources, so that you get these multi-billion-dollar subsidies, tax breaks, free research and development, so that you get protection from competition through import quotas, so that you get licenses and monopolies and routes sealed off from competition. And when this occurs, you break down the arm's length relationship between government and business, which is the most serious single breakdown in the vitality of a democratic polity to respond to the problems of the age. Because if people are being
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, consumer interest advocate Ralph Nader was heard in part one of a talk recorded last November in the James Hilton Coliseum here at Iowa State. Part two of Mr. Nader's address, beginning just prior to where we ended today, will be heard next week at 11 o'clock. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.